Hello, everybody. Good to see so many people joining us today. There's been some excellent content today. Hopefully you enjoyed the session so far. So today I'm going to be talking about ALM for Power Platform data. So as you know, data is probably one of the most important and core assets for an organization, and DataVerse is, the place where you store and manage data. And when we do projects, there's lots of challenges sometimes around, how do I move data from one environment to another? How do I manage the data? So hopefully we'll try and answer some of these questions in this session today. So let's move forward. So here's the agenda for today. So I'm going to start with a little bit of introduction around data, and especially in the context of DataVerse. Then we're going to move on to talk about some of the data workflows that you can do and data tools. And finally, we're going to finish off by how do you then use pipelines to manage some of these concepts and data that we spoke about earlier. And obviously, we'll leave some time for Q&A where I'll try and answer as many questions as I can as well. So before we move forward, so I'm Wael Hamze. I'm a Power Platform lead and business applications MVP. There is a few links here to things like my Twitter, LinkedIn, YouTube channels. So feel free to connect and reach out to me on these channels or subscribe to some of these channels where I will try and keep you updated with some of the recent developments on the Power Platform. Okay, so DataVerse. So as you can see, DataVerse is quite important. It sits, as part of one of the core components of the Power Platform that is core to a lot of the other technologies that we have, like Power Pages, Power Automate, Power Apps, and most of the data. I mean, you can obviously use data from lots of other different sources, such as SharePoint and other data sources that you may have. But when it comes to ALM and most of the solutions that you'll build, DataVerse is quite key. So for the session today, I'm going to be focusing on DataVerse and the data that you have within DataVerse and how you manage that data as part of your application lifecycle management. So let's talk about storage. I'm just going to give a little bit of introduction to the different things that we need to consider about when working with data within DataVerse. So first is about storage. So as you know, DataVerse has got different types of storage in it. So one of them is database storage, which is basically SQL. So this is where you have your, tables and, attributes and, so most of your data would go into the database level. So whether that's, your business data and the tables, but also the metadata around some of the things that you do using the configuration. We also have file storage. File storage is basically used for managing files. So things like attachments, photos, and videos that you can use as part of building your solutions. And we also have the log storage, which is primarily used for managing things like the audit data. So as you can see, there's lots of different types of storage, and each one is optimized for storing the specific type of data that is designed for. So when we talk about data types as well, this is quite important to understand all the different data types that we would come across when we're working with DataVerse. So the first is metadata. So metadata is more about, so if you're doing, creating tables and things, there is all sorts of metadata that is generated as part of that. When you're creating apps, there is metadata. So that's one type of data that you need to be aware of. The next type is configuration data. So this is basically configuration that you do based on the environment itself. So whether that's settings or things like environment variables or maybe some other configuration data you may have to configure your solution, that falls part of the configuration data. And then we have something called the reference data. So reference data is basically the data that doesn't change very often. It's mostly static data that can change over a period of time, but isn't normally classed as your typical transactional data. And I'll show you a few examples later on. And then we have the business data, which is basically sits on top of the reference data. And this is the transactional data. So think like contacts or accounts that is classed as business data. And then finally, we have the audit data, which is basically once you take actions on the business data, then sometimes you have the option to record certain events based on these actions to know, who's done what and when, basically. So that's the data types, and then let's talk about the purposes of the data as well. So in a lot of cases, you would have data in the development environment, and the purpose of that data is just to kind of facilitate the development of a certain feature. So you may create some records here and there just to kind of, build something and see how it works. We also sometimes have test data. So once you deploy a solution to a test environment, you will typically have some test data in there. It's probably more structured than dev environment data, and it may kind of cover lots of different scenarios, but you also have test data. And then you may have something like the sample data. So if you've got a demo environment, you deploy the solution, you want somebody to kind of play with the environment and understand the capabilities, and the data can actually help bring out some of these features, especially if you have dashboards. So again, you have sample data in some cases, and then finally we've got the production data. So obviously, when it comes to ALM, you have to worry about different data types. You don't necessarily need to worry about the storage because that's handled for you by the platform, but you need to worry about how do you handle different data types, and you may need to have a different strategy for how do you handle the different purposes of the data. So whether it's a sample, dev, and production data. And finally, I wanted to bring another topic as well, which is data sensitivity. So every time you put data somewhere, it has sensitivity associated with it. So these are the typical sensitivities that you see in most organizations. They may be called different names or may have a slight variation on them. But typically you have things like public data, which is basically anyone can see. You have general data, which is maybe internal to the organization. And you have then the levels of confidential and more sensitive data. So when it comes to ALM and pipelines, you need to be aware of the sensitivity of the data because for example, you wouldn't necessarily want to handle secrets in version control or maybe some sensitive data and version control. So you need to actually make sure that whatever process you come up with and wherever you decide to store that data, then it's stored in line with the sensitivity of that data as well. So hopefully that gives you some idea about the different things that we need to be aware of when we come to work with DataVerse and with some of the ALM capabilities relating to data. So I will move forward now. So this is the slide where it talks about a little bit about how does each data type impact the kind of things that we need to do from an ALM perspective. So let's start with metadata, for example. So you need basically ALM capabilities for metadata, and this is mostly handled by the solutions. And typically, you move the same solution to different environments, so there isn't a lot of environment variation. Then we have configuration data. You need ALM to handle configuration data, so things like environment variables. And then again, this configuration data will be different per environment, so you need to decide how you handle that. And you can, to a certain extent, move some of that information using solutions as well, depending on what kind of configuration data you have. And then we have reference data. So reference data is a required part of ALM solutions because you basically need to make sure that that data is consistent. So sometimes you may have lookups or dashboards or workflows or other things that may be referencing that data. And sometimes in a lot of cases, the references are based on GUIDs. So you need to make sure that that data is consistent across the environments. So typically that data doesn't vary per environment. You may have a subset of data, for example, in some environments if you've got a huge set of reference data, but it's not solution aware. So you need to worry about how to do that as part of your ALM process. And then we have business data. So this is typically, the transactional data. So again, You may or you may not need ALM for this, but if, for example, if you're migrating from a legacy environment, you may need some data migration packages. So I'm not going to talk too much about business data today, but it's something that may require a little bit more complexity, especially if you're migrating large volumes of business data. And finally, the audit data. Obviously, you don't need to worry about ALM. The audit data will be different per environment, but you basically just turn things on and off, but you don't have to worry too much about it. And obviously, you can't transport it because it's based on the actions within that environment. So for today's session, I'm gonna primarily focus on this bit here, which is reference data. And then if you've got any obviously questions around some of the other bits, then I'm happy to take these as well. So we're going to talk about the demo data I'm going to be talking about today in this demo. So we have a table called food, and food will have a category. So there's a many-to-one relationship. And then we have nutrients. And then so each food will be made basically of a number of different nutrients, and there are relationships between them. So so the food categories are unlikely to change over time. So I would class them as reference data. Whereas things like foods, they will change, quite frequently based on environments and over time. So I would class these as business data. So in the demos today, we're going to see how these two fit together, and we're going to see how we can manage this type of reference data. So just to bring this to life, I'm just going to show you some of the things in the DataVerse environment now. So just give me a moment. So this is one of my dev environments. So let's go to foods, for example. So I've got a database of foods in here. So for example, if we want to look at one of them, let's say grilled asparagus. So basically this is a record in a table, and you can see this is, let's say this is the business data. But now we're starting to reference things like the category. So this is reference data. So if I click on that, it's basically just describing the category. It's got a parent category as well. So this information here is stored in the food categories, for example. So that is a table that stores my reference data, and every category has got code and parent category. If we go back as well into that record as well, if we go to related entities, let's see what that food is made up of. So we can see all the different breakdowns of the different ingredients of that. So if I double click on that, again, you can see that each one of them has got a reference to a nutrient, which is basically what the food is made up of. And again, we got the different nutrients in here, which is basically a list of different things that foods are made up of. So it's unlikely that this kind of data will change. And ideally, I want this data to be consistent across all the environments, because I may have certain dashboards or processes that run based on these specific types. So I want the GUIs to be the same. I want this data to be exactly the same in all my environments. However, this kind of data, this is going to change. People may create new things all the time. So this is more business data. So I'm not going to worry too much about it at the moment in the pipelines. Okay. Any questions so far? Okay, I'll probably take questions in the end as well. So Power Platform development. So yeah, so when it comes to Power Platform development, we have different types of people possibly interacting with the platform. We have business users. We may have pro developers working on some codes. So when it comes to working with data as well, there will be lots of people that would input into the data within the organization. So things like the reference data. You may have SMEs that are from the business that may be interacting with the data. They may want to contribute to editing that data. And you would typically, so if we think about reference data, for example, ideally you want to have an environment for that reference data that is stable, and you manage that data in there. And then you want to take that data then into something more stable, like a version control system, where you can actually master that data. So ideally you would want like the business users to interact with the data in a kind of user-friendly tool. Pro developers may have, other ways of updating that data using scripting and other tools, but for most business users, you want to keep that process as simple as possible. But you want ideally the whole team, which is kind of the Fusion team, to be able to participate in the same workflow. So in today's session, I'll show you some of the ways where we can achieve that using some of the tools that are available in Power Platform. So one of the first tools that I'm going to talk about today is the configuration migration tool. So this is a tool that is provided as part of the Power Platform, and it allows you to move data across different environments. So you can get that tool using a NuGet library. So this is the full name of the tool. You can download it using that mechanism. There is also a PowerShell module that allows you to automate some of the actions using that PowerShell module. So you've got the option to use an app, and you've got the option to write some scripts as well that can automate some of these processes. So the way this process starts is you typically have a source environment. So you would typically have the data and metadata in that source environment. So it could either be a dev environment or if you have more environments, it could be a designated environment for things like reference data that you have potentially less number of people that access that data, because typically in a dev environment, you may need to change the records a lot, or you may want to try different things. But if you have a dedicated environment, then you have a little bit more control over there. You can make sure that you've got the the records stable. So you decide on your source environment, and then you basically, using a configuration migration tool, you can build a schema. And the schema is nothing more than saying what tables and what attributes you're interested in. So once you define what data is your reference data and how you match against the reference data, then basically you then use the schema and you go to the environment and export that data. And what you get from that is a zip file, which is basically all the data that you are interested in a zip file. And what the tool then allows you to do is basically import that data to another environment. So you basically start with your source environment, you create a schema, you export, and then you put that export somewhere safe, and then you have the option to import that into more than one environment downstream as well. So so this is how the tool looks like. So just as I described previously, you have the ability to create a schema, and then you have the ability to import and export the data. So I'm just going to show you how the schema looks like, so you get an idea. So this is how the tool looks like. I'm just gonna, sorry, 1 second. Let me just minimize that so the screen is a bit more clear. Okay, so this is how the tool looks like. So I've got a schema that I've created previously, so it's already there. So I'm just gonna open this one up. But basically you decide what solution you want to work with. So you can either select an out-of-the-box solution or a solution that you have, and then you decide on what entities you want. So you can see that the naming is not updated here. So you select the tables that you want, and then you've either got the option to add all the attributes, or you can define specific attributes. So in this case, like in the food category, for example, I defined the name, the parent, the code, and the ID. Because I want the IDs to be the same in every environment, so I export the ID as well. And one of the options that you have in the tool is actually you can decide on the import settings. So you can decide actually, so by default, it will use things like names, but you can decide how you want to match when it imports to a target environment. So if you've got like composite keys, or if you've got a special attribute that you want to match against, you can then decide to match against that. So you could, for example, decide that I actually want to match on the ID, and when I import to the target environment, it will it will basically try and find a record with the same ID. If it finds it, it will update the record. If it doesn't find it, you know, it will basically you know, create a new record. And you've got a bunch of other options, such as if you want to disable plugins when you're loading data, or you don't want to update records. So yeah, you can even filter records as well. So by default, it will basically get all the records from the environment. But for example, if you've disabled some record and you're only interested in the active records, then you can obviously edit the fetch XML query in here, and it will basically limit the records that you get from that environment, which can be useful in a lot of cases, especially if you're dealing with things like teams and other things. So that's the schema definition. You know, you can add relationships and other bits. So once you've had the schema, then basically all you have to do is then if you exit from that, then you have to basically follow the same process, which is basically import and export. So I'm not going to show you that. There's lots of documentation for that in Microsoft Learn, but I'm going to show you how to maybe do some of these things inside automation and pipelines. Okay. So I'm going to close this tool for now, and I'm going to move on to the next slide. So Power Platform CLI. So this is a basic command line interface that basically makes it easy to do a lot of the actions that we need to do as part of administration and development when in the context of Power Platform. So there's lots of PowerShell modules and there's lots of tools. The Power Platform CLI is great because it consolidates a lot of that functionality, and it gives us access to this functionality quite easily using a very simple interface to use. You can get the Power Apps CLI from a NuGet library. You can also install it as an MSI, and this is the list of functionality that is currently available in the Power Apps CLI. The functionality is increasing quite rapidly. It's a very frequently updated tool. When it comes to data, there is a number of different tools in here. So there is Pack Data, which basically allows us to import and export data from DataVerse, and it uses the same engine as the configuration migration tool. If you are working with portals, which I'm not going to cover in this session, but it's important to mention as well that the Pack CLI provides a capability to basically export and import data or metadata that is relating to the portal's configuration as well. So you can do that using the Pack CLI as well. So so this is the Pack CLI. I'm going to do a quick demo of Pack CLI as well. So let's do that. Sorry. Let's find the right screen. Okay. So once you install the Pack CLI, if you type Pack in the command line, it will basically list you all the different actions you can do. And one of the things that has been released recently is the ability to, for example, access some of the tools that we use frequently with the Power Platform and DataVerse. So for example, now you've got access to the configuration migration tool, you've got access to the plugin registration tool and the package deployer. So if you want to fire one of these tools, you can install them using this tool. And if I want to open the CMT tool as well, it will open that tool that I was just working with previously as well. So again, it's trying to give you access to a lot of the things that you need from a single entry point, which is very useful. So if we want to work with data, basically I've got a command line in here that I've prepared previously. So if you want to work with data, we basically have to run pack data export, and then you provide a schema file, which is an XML file that is generated using the configuration migration tool. So that file you generate manually using that tool, and then you specify the folder where you want that data to go, and then you specify the environment where you want to export that data from. So once you do that, it will basically go to the environment and start exporting the data. I've already created my connection strings before, so it's using my credentials that I've already prepared. So as that export is running, it's going to basically create a zip file in that folder. So you can see the zip file is already here. So what it does basically, it gives you the schema in that zip file, and it gives you a file basically with all the data. So you can see all the things that I've showed you before in that DataVerse environment, like all the vitamins and other things, and the food categories, they're all here. And you can see with the food categories, it's got parents. So you have to process things in a certain order. So you have to create basically the top level records first, and then you have to add the other records. So this tool handles that for you. So it will do multiple runs basically to get that data and the right shape basically. So it's a big file, and if you do have lots of records, this file will can get quite huge, and it can be a challenge to run it under version control. So I'll show you some of the things you can do to help with that. So that's the zip file. Now, if you wanted to import that data, for example, into a different environment, then pretty much you can run another tool, which is basically the import tool. You specify that zip file and then the URL of the environment, which basically goes ahead and imports that data into another environment. But I'm not going to show you that today. In the interest of time, I'm just going to go back to the slides and show you. We can talk a little bit more about pipelines. So before we go into pipelines, I'm just going to put a little bit of summary around the configuration migration tool. There is probably other tools you can use to do similar things. When it comes to the configuration migration tool, for example, obviously it's free to use. It's easy to use. As you can see, it's an app that you can easily use. It takes care of relationship. It's ALM compatible. It does the key matching. You can disable plugins. You can even manage the date and time for sample data to make sure that if you deploy sample data, the data is relevant. If you have certain dashboards that you want to show, for example, what's my tasks for today, you can actually create the tasks within certain dates and times as well. Some of the downsides, as I said, the file it generates one file which is big. Sometimes the XML in it is not sorted, so it can cause problems when it comes to version control. If you have large volumes of data, it does reprocess all the records, so it may take a long time if you've got lots of reference data. So you may have to think about potentially splitting packages or putting some optimizations in there. Getting a view of the failures sometimes is not very easy. You have to kind of look in the log files. There isn't like an interface where it shows you all the records and the arrows next to them. And it's probably not designed for large data volumes like data migrations and things like that. And it may not support all the out-of-the-box entities that may have some specific rules around them, and it doesn't support deletes as well. So you have to handle the deletes. So hopefully that gives you some idea around, the suitability of these tools for some of the scenarios that you may have. There are other alternatives that you may use, whether they are third-party products or things like the Azure Data Factory and other PaaS components. But this is a good place to start, and in a lot of cases, it will meet your requirements without having to resort to additional tools. So I'm just going to talk about some of the other capabilities that you can use when it comes to data and data reference data migration. So there is obviously the Power Platform build tools, which now support some of these capabilities, and there is the Power DevOps tool, which has got some additional capabilities as well that may come useful in certain scenarios. I will show you this shortly when it comes to managing reference data. So both of these tools are available from the Azure DevOps Marketplace, so you can go ahead and give them a try and try to use them in the projects if they meet your requirements. So I'm just gonna jump into the demo as well. So let's go and look at some of the pipelines now. Okay. But before we do that, let's assume we want to make a change to one of these records in the dev environments. So this data shouldn't change very often, but most likely on a project, you will have to change data from time to time. So let's say we've got a new type called DataVerse based on today's demo. So I'm just gonna basically save that record in the dev environment. So now I've got a new record in the dev environment, and I want to promote that into my let's say build environment, which is the next environment. So let's talk about the process first. So we have ideally we want to keep all our changes in version control, whether that's solutions or data. So in this case, I've got most of the changes in version control, and I've got a folder for data, I've got reference data in there, and I've got the schema. So the schema that I've created using the configuration migration tool, which basically will generate an XML file, I store in here. And basically, once I have that, then everyone's on the same page in the team. So this is quite important, because otherwise, different people may have different versions of the schema file. So it's important that you store the schema file in version control so you can manage the changes to that and you can see changes over time. And then I also have a folder that I've stored the data, and I'll come to the contents of this folder in a bit. But I've got a branch for this demo called the DataVerse Summit. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna try and commit my data into version control. And I'm going to put it in the DataVerse Summit branch, and I'm going to generate a pull request. So if you're a pro developer, you can probably use the Power Apps or Power Platform CLI, and get the data.zip file, then run a PowerShell script to unzip it, and then create a standard commit using Git. So today I'm going to show you how you can make that process easier. So imagine you have a business user that wants to make changes to the data. So they've gone ahead, they made just changes in here in the dev environment, and once they make the changes, they want that data to basically be moved to the next environment. Obviously, you can do that manually using the configuration migration tool, but then the more environments you have, the more risk there is that things will go wrong and will become too much of an overhead. So let's take a look at this pipeline. Before I show you what this pipeline is doing, I'm just gonna run this pipeline. So basically, I'm gonna run this pipeline. I'm gonna run it on that branch basically that we have here. So let me just trigger that. Just move this window. Run. So this pipeline is gonna run, and while it's running, I'm gonna show you what this pipeline is doing. So it's going to use the Power DevOps tools. So the first step it's going to basically connect into the dev environment. It's going to reference that schema file. So this schema file is basically here in version control. That's in that repo. And then I'm going to specify that I want to export the data using that schema file from this environment into this data.zip file, which is in this folder. And you've got the option to specify the timeouts, settings for the connections, and you've got the options to specify the logs directory in case you want to, take a look at the logs, after you run this build in case there are any issues. You got the same capability with the Power Platform build tools. This is tasks that has been added recently, so there's likely to be some improvements and changes to it going forward. So again, you can select the environment and the schema and the data.zip, and you've got the option to override as well. It doesn't have some of the other things like the connection timeout and the logs directory at the moment. So so basically what we've done so far is we've exported the data and we got that zip file. One of the challenges I have with this so far is that it's not very useful to have that zip file in version control because you're not going to be able to see the changes. So the next thing we can do is we can export that zip file or extract it and then store the files in version control. So the next challenge I would have with that is that you would have one file with all your records, and it's very difficult to manage. Imagine you've got like 20 entities and you made a change to one of them, and then now you have to scroll through that file, see the changes, and it gets a bit difficult, especially when you have a lot of data to start to open these files in Visual Studio or in other tools. So and it gets difficult to see quickly, you know, what entities you've changed. So we've got another task in the toolkit that basically solves that problem. So you give it the data.zip file and you tell it where in version control it needs to put it. So what it's going to do is going to extract that file, and it can do a number of two different things. So it can sort the data, so it's version control compatible. So it will sort the data. So, you know, if a new record comes in, it will come in the right order. And it can also split the data into different files. So if you've got, you know, 10 records, you would have, 10 different tables, you would have, you know, 10 different files. And then after that, it's going to basically commit that data change into that branch, and it's going to generate a pull request for us. So let's go ahead and see what happened. So this basically build has completed. If we click on what's happened, you can see the data has been exported, and you can see, you know, the different, you know, it gives you all the logs of what's happening, and it also gives you the files, the log files. So if you've got any challenges, you can get into these logs and find out what's gone wrong with that. So that's the build completed successfully. So if I go into the repo first, I'm going to show you how this looks. So you've got the data file, which typically would have all the data in here, but doesn't have anything at the moment. It's just got the timestamp and the entities. And then I've got a different file for each of the different entities. So that basically shows you all the data for each of the entities. If we go into the pull requests now, let's look at all the active pull requests. So we've got a reference data change about 3 minutes ago. Ignore this error because it's coming from another build. But if I look at the changes, you can see that I can easily see now that all I'm changing is that this table. I didn't see the food categories table because I didn't make changes to it. I can see that the timestamp has changed, but also I can see the record that I've added, and that record is sorted. It's going to come in the right order. So if I add another record, it should come in the right order. So you can see I've added that DataVerse record in here. So that's the first build. All it's doing is just generating a pull request. So all I have to do is now basically review that pull request and approve it, you know, if I'm happy with it. So the business user could have an easy way to trigger that build after they create the data. And then after we do that, then I've got another build, which is basically, let me run this build again. So I'm going to run it on that branch as well, just going to generate a package from that branch. At this stage, you would typically commit to master and then generate a build from that. But, you know, in this case, I'm just going to run it on this branch. So I'll let that run. I'll show you what it's doing as well. So again, this is using the same tool set. So we got the data and version control now. So all we have to do is just generate that data.zip file again. So again, there's another task for that. So you give it the data that you give it the file that you want to generate, and you tell it, you know, where in version control you've extracted all these files. So if you decided to split the files, you can use this task to combine the files. If you don't want to split the files, you don't have to. You can just untick this box and it will just zip whatever is in that folder. And then it will publish the artifacts. So basically, if we look at that build, this build should run very quickly because all it's doing is just working on version control. So you can see, even though I'm using version control, now I've got the data.zip file. So it's the same data.zip file, except I've got a lot more control over the changes and traceability now. And the final step is to deploy that build basically into the next environment. So in this case, I've got a pipeline just for that data. So I'm gonna deploy that build into the next environment. But you could combine these as part of your kind of pipelines that have solutions. So I believe there is more sessions today to talk about solutions and how you do pipelines for solutions, so you can combine data and solutions in the same pipeline. So whilst this is running, I'm going to show you what this is doing. So again, there's a task to import the data. So in this case, you specify the file, which is the data.zip file, which is basically from the build that we've created. So that's the build that we just executed with the data.zip file. And then you've got a number of different options, which are, from the configuration migration tool. You can choose like threads, and you could map users. If you exported data from one environment, but you don't have the same user in the other environment, you could map the users. And then you've got other options like batch modes and other things. These are very kind of detailed settings that you would use in certain cases if you've got certain specific requirements or issues. And again, you've got the logs directory. Again, there is another task that's been recently released as well as part of the Power Platform build tools, which basically, again, you can give it the zip file and it will go ahead and import the data. I believe at this point in time, it doesn't have some of the configuration options which you may or may not need based on your scenarios. So if we go back into the pipeline, we can see that this deployment has just completed. We can look at the logs. We can see the import task. It will show you, all the activities that are happening depending on your log level settings. At the moment, there are some of it in verbose, so you can see all the different updates that are basically happening to that data. And the idea is that we get the data into this environment once the deployment is completed. It will take a bit of time, but you can see it's already there. So we've got the DataVerse record here now. So that's the record that was just created using our service account today, a few moments ago. So so hopefully this gives you an idea in terms of how you can create an automated process for managing your data and move it from one environment to another, and how you can make it easy for different people to interact with that process by automating some of the steps using pipelines, or even better, you could create some apps on top of it. So I'm going to go back to the slides and just quickly wrap things up before we leave some time for questions as well. So there is another technology in the Power Platform, which is data flows as well. So data flows basically is another low-code capability that basically allows you to basically look at a data source, and that could be DataVerse, or it could be some of the SaaS and PaaS components, or even files. And it allows you to transform the data, and then a data flow would run basically in the cloud, and then you could import that data to another environment, which in this case, it's the process supports DataVerse. So in theory, you could take data from one DataVerse environment, and you could run a process in the cloud, which is using the data flows, and you could move it into another DataVerse environment. One of the good things that Dataflow has is the ability to run complex transformations, which you don't necessarily have in the configuration migration tool. So you would have to do some pre and post processing steps in the configuration migration tool to achieve that, which could be done using things like the package deployer and potentially things like PowerShell scripts. But again, you're going into that development area as opposed to doing something using low code. So these are some of the points to mention about data flows. It's included in some of the licensing, so there's a good chance you will have access to that already. You've got a very easy and powerful, query and transformation language in the form of Power Query that you can use to build your data flows. You've got access to a lot more data sources than the configuration migration tool, and you can still import the data into DataVerse. You can add them to solutions. I think the solution support is not fully mature yet, so there are some limitations in there. And obviously this works on moving data between source and target, so there is no integration between version control. So why I found this tool useful is sometimes you could, if you've got data in multiple sources, you can get that data into DataVerse. And then once the data is in DataVerse, you could then use the configuration migration tool to move the data using ALM into some of the other environments. So if you're thinking about reference data, you got something in Excel or some other source, you could then use data flows to move that into DataVerse, and then you could use the configuration migration to then build the source control integration and some of the other gates that you may need. So this is all I wanted to show you today. Hopefully you found that useful. I'm open to take some question now about anything you've seen today or anything relating to this topic that you would like to ask as well.
Thank you, Wael. There are a few questions in the chat. The first question is from Rabi, who's asking, any insights on when ALM accelerator to general availability? We are not comfortable to use preview.
ALM accelerator. Are we talking about the task in the Power DevOps tools?
Yeah, I've got a feeling that's the add-on to the COE toolkit. I'm guessing. Rabi, do you want to confirm? And then Rabi saying, can you please let us know? Here we go. So next question is by Ravi. Here we go, Ravi, who's asking, for reference data, is it recommended to use Profici? I've never heard of Profici, to be honest.
I'm not familiar with that tool as well.
Ravi, do you want to validate what do you mean by Profici? I've never heard of that one. Ravi is saying, is the ALM approach similar to other platforms such as Appian, Pega, Camunda? Is the process more complicated in Power Platform compared to its peers? It almost cracked me up that one, that question a little bit. But yeah, so Wael, obviously feel free. I know your whole session has been on that complexity, but feel free to kind of help Ravi understand those complexities a bit better.
I'm aware of tools like Appian, but I've not kind of utilized these tools myself, so I wouldn't be able to kind of compare complexity between Power Platform and these tools. There is lots of different options, I would say, in the Power Platform depending on the type of the user. So if you're a pro dev type of user, there is different levels of options that come with complexity, but also flexibility. But there are also lots of tools that you can use from a kind of citizen developer business user perspective, like data flows and some of the kind of simple tools like the configuration migration console as well. So it's not a complex process. I think it's as complex as you want to make it. And in general, I think the recommendation is to kind of make the process as simple and as easy to consume for the users as possible.
So Renk Jan is asking, how do you change those date times for sample data? Is there a way to do this programmatically, or is it a setting to do that?
There is a setting in the configuration migration tool. So similar to where you kind of set the keys, where you select the keys, there's another setting where you can shift the times as well. So yeah, it can be done using the configuration migration tool. It will basically become part of the schema file. Yeah.
So Piyush is asking, extract task is not available in Power Platform build tools?
I'm not aware that the extract or so the task is available. I mean, you could obviously, depends, I guess, what you're trying to achieve. If you just want to take the zip and put it into, you know, put the contents of the zip into the source control, then you can easily do that using some of the other tasks that are available. If you want to start sorting and splitting the files, I don't believe that functionality is available. So this is something that I've added because I had challenges in certain scenarios where I wanted actually to be able to have the visibility and the sorting to make the pull request process a lot easier and manageable.
So Coquelin is asking, I use LinkPad script to sync ref data between environments as it gives full flexibility. What's your thought on LinkPad script compared to the options you discussed today?
I've heard about the LinkPad script, but I've not used it personally, so I can't really comment on. But if you've got some experiences, you know, you're more than welcome to share that with that tool. But I can't compare because I've not used it.
So Coquelin is saying, thanks for your great session. He says you should join the Power Platform Build Tools team at Microsoft, as most of the ALM tasks were first introduced by your tool, and it's slowly making the Power Platform Build Tools.
Thank you for the suggestion.
And then the final question by Rabi is ALM Accelerator is discussed in previous session. It was suggested that it could be used for ALM. Should we use that or create our own pipeline? This question was not for ALM, is not for ALM for data, but maybe Wael has some insight on it.
Should you use the ALM accelerator or should you create your own pipelines? I think that the way I would approach the problem is basically I would take a look at the ALM accelerator functionality and then decide whether the functionality meets your requirements. Because if it does meet your requirements, then there's a lot of effort that, you know, gone into building the ALM accelerator, and it's got a lot of features that are useful. So it will take you time to replicate these features in your own pipelines. The good thing about the ALM accelerator, however, if for whatever reason you don't decide to use it, everything is based on templates and it's open source, so you can potentially pick and choose the bits that are relevant to your project and, you know, build upon these. Obviously, if you do that, then you may not get like the regular updates and things like that. So yeah, that's how I would approach any tool. If it meets your requirements and it, you know, then use it. If not, then try and use from it as much as you can, or, you know, resort to the kind of your own pipelines if you can't use it.
And Philip mentioned a comment, even if the ALM accelerator isn't a fit for you, it's a really good place to borrow from.
Yeah, I mean, it's got lots of things like how to manage connection references and how to manage some of the other things. And it gives you an idea of how something could work. So it's definitely lots of scope to borrow ideas and code and things from it and make it work for your organization and your project if you've got the time, obviously.
Yeah, and Piyush's last comment, ALM Accelerator is majorly to enable citizen developers to use source control along with pro devs.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's all the questions. Wael, thank you so much for sharing your insight with us and educating us all. Wael, before you go, are you able to share your contact details, your blog, so that the community can keep in touch with you as well as continue their learning offline in relation to ALM?
I will definitely put all the links in the chat, so feel free to connect and send me questions. I will try and answer as much as I can. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Wael, for joining us today. And we hope to see you next time, but in person.
Yeah, looking forward to that. Looking forward to see everybody. It's been a while.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Wael. See you soon. Fantastic. There you go, guys.